Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Declan Hill on the topic of corruption in international sport. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation and an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. Every week on the program, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of international relations here to the studio at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And today my guest is Declan Hill. He is an author, a journalist, and an academic, and he's just come out with a brand new book called An Insider's Guide to Match Fixing in Football. So welcome to the show.
Great, thank you for having me.
Well, first off, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
When did you first become interested in match fixing?
I was an investigative journalist for a Canadian documentary program, very much like 60 Minutes or Panorama in the US or UK. And we were looking at the links between key Russian mafia figures and National Hockey League players, hockey as in ice hockey,
Yep.
that is really the religion of Canada and a major sport in the United States. And we were over in Moscow interviewing the guy FBI and US Congress at that time had identified as, quote, the head of the Russian mafia. And he was a very cordial Georgian gentleman who took us out for dinner afterwards at his Georgian restaurant. And we were a bit stuck for conversation. And so I said, I guess you like hockey, do you? And he said, yeah, I like hockey, it's okay, but I really love football. And he began to tell the story of how he was at the 1994 World Cup in Pasadena, in California, in the United States, when they're having their final. And he just wasn't in the stadium, he was in the VVIP section, the very, very important people section, along with a whole bunch of dignitaries. And he wasn't just in that box, so that there's maybe 200-300 people. He was right in the front row, one or two along from the then president of FIFA. And I had two thoughts in my head at that moment. I thought, one, I really hope I get out of this restaurant alive. And two, if I do, what was this particular man doing at the very epicenter of the world's sport?
Right.
So I had the good fortune to get a scholarship to go to University of Oxford a few years later, study informal governance and corruption studies. And that was really the impetus, so we were able to take a look at informal governance and corruption inside sport.
Right. So just so our audience is clear, what do you mean by match fixing?
Well, match fixing is the great cancer that will destroy sport because it's transforming a game, a competition where people are supposedly running around as hard as they can, into theater, into a prearranged World Wrestling Federation kind of nonsense and things. And, I don't use that word lightly. I remember interviewing a guy when I was doing my doctorate who was a Serie A player, or at least a former Serie A player, very good player. And he was quite open about fixing, and he said, I really hate fixing. I don't like it. You know why? Because I'm a football player. I'm not an actor.
Right.
And this is what match fixing will do. It will destroy competitive sport around the world.
So how is it done?
Well, look, fixing corruption in sport is not a new phenomenon. If you were to go to the site of the ancient Olympics in Olympia, in Greece now, you would see outside the stadium a row of ruined statues. And those statues were built with the money taken from coaches and athletes several, a couple of thousand years ago who were caught fixing and cheating. And so their punishment was to pay money so that statues of the gods would be erected. So in my books, in my work, in my speeches, I'm not trying to say, oh, look, there's this brand new phenomenon, fixing. We've had it in baseball. We had it in chariot racing, the Byzantine empires. We had it in, archery competitions. We had it, Emperor Nero is renowned for fixing the Olympics. So that is not a new phenomenon. But what I identified is sadly a new phenomenon of globalization, the same things that drive much of your own study at this institution, and sports corruption.
Right.
And it's as if the petrol, the oil of globalization has hit the fire of sports corruption, and you have now a fire that is engulfing sports around the world.
So if you had to estimate, how big is this problem?
Look, two things. One is it's a massive problem just because of the nature of it.
Right.
Fixing, as I show in my second book, which is the academic book, The Fix, which is now out in 21 languages and is optioned in Hollywood, is a very journalistic account. My second book is much more the kind of thing that you and I are interested in, the academic analysis behind it. Right. And one of the things I get into it is the difference between cheating. So that's the kind of stuff that Lance Armstrong does or did, and other well-known cheats. And that's where they're actually trying to win. Right. They're just using illegal or informal methods to win.
Right.
And actually, most spectators are relatively benign in their judgment towards that. I believe that Lance Armstrong at some time in the future will be utterly rehabilitated. Because he was trying to win at all times. Fixing is where they're trying to lose.
Right.
And that is an unforgivable sin as far as most fans are concerned. What you have got because of this fixing to lose, this cheating to lose, is an elephant's graveyard of sports right across the continent of Asia.
Right.
Again, if there's anyone who isn't familiar with Asian sports, those are going to sound, grandiose terms. But I beg people, if they're watching this and they have any suspicions of my credibility, just go online and check the following scandals. Taiwanese baseball. It started with 13 teams in the early 90s. It's now down to 4. Japanese sumo wrestling, South Korean soccer, motorboat racing. Heck, now, Andrew, they're even fixing e-gaming.
Right.
So there's sports which still haven't even caught on the mainstream in North America and Europe that are being fixed over there. And they're being fixed over there because of a powerful, enormous gambling market. Right. Most of it illegal, most of it unregulated, and it's estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
Wow. Now, you've talked about a sports corruption industry. What do you mean by this, and who are the players involved?
I'm afraid it's a very cynical and skeptical approach by much of the sports industry. Not all of it, by much of it. There's a fantastic film that I advise our viewers to watch to understand some of the structure, some of the mechanisms, and some of the motivations of fixing. And that's by a U.S. director called John Sayles. It's called 8 Men Out. It's about the Chicago White Sox fixing of the World Series in 1919. And there's a fantastic line in it where they say there's a parade forming down Main Street to fight against fixing in baseball. And the league wants to be at the head of the parade and direct where that parade goes. Right. We see the same kind of thing now with the anti-match fixing industry. You have consultants, you have very dodgy, weird people emerging saying, oh, listen to my research or listen to this stuff. It's very much akin to the anti-terrorism industry that was generated since 9/11, where you have trillions of dollars being wasted in wars. And really the effect of terrorism is still there because they're really guiding the research, guiding the work to putting money in their own pockets as opposed to actually solving the issues.
Now, your recent work has focused on football. What other
soccer
too? Yes. This is obviously not restricted to soccer. What other sports and really global internationalized sports are particularly vulnerable to this kind of external manipulation?
Andrew, before I answer the direct question, let me just finish the paradigm of what's happening in the world of sports. Asian sports have a number of honorable exceptions which have not been corrupted, but they are genuinely honorable exceptions. And what's happened is that many sports fans in Asia have said, look, enough. I'm not going to pay money to go to my local soccer team or my local whatever and waste my money. Right. I'm going to turn my attention to European sports. I'm going to watch Manchester United or Real Madrid or whatever. So what has happened is that the sports industry in Asia has become also globalized and is focusing on European sports. That means that market, that illegal gambling market, is now focused on European sports. And of course it means that the fixers are now traveling to Europe to fix games in Europe. Right. So you have this weird globalized sports corruption of networks of criminals and corrupted players, league officials, referees stretching around the world. You also have this immensely powerful Asian gambling market. So cricket has got major
Right.
problems. Tennis has got major problems. Tennis, of course, is the easiest game in the world to fix.
Sure.
Why? Because there are two individuals playing. We knock the ball back and forth, and then suddenly I clutch my hamstring in the middle of the second set and say, hey, I can't play on anymore. And tennis also has a problem because of income disparity between the top 20 or 30 players who are fantastic, and it quickly drops off a chasm after that. And you have people that just are really struggling on the tour to make money. And suddenly, there's this other new way of making cash by losing games, by not trying it, but by strategically placing your effort, you can make a lot of money. E-gaming, as I was saying, I wasn't even aware of e-gaming until about a year ago.
Right.
I've now got interested in it. Pinnacle Sportsbook last week pulled off some e-gaming from their sites because they thought that there was corruption going on there. So the power of this globalized sports gambling market is now so large, it's touching and affecting almost every sport in the world.
Right. Now, I mean, there are, for football, for instance, you have FIFA, and for the Olympics, you have the International Olympic Committee. You have these international governing bodies. What are they doing to mitigate the damage that's being caused by fixing?
Well, first of all, I have to say the head of FIFA, Sepp Blatter, the head of the Olympic movement, the International Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach, the head of UEFA, Michel Platini, have all spoken very strongly against this new globalized match fixing.
Right.
Bach has actually put together a fund of over $10 million saying specifically to fight against it, saying this is our number one issue. We really have to deal with this properly. Blatter has certainly spoken about this. And UEFA, after my first book, flew me to Nyon, Switzerland, where their headquarters are, and said, okay, we've read your book. What are we going to do? How do we deal with this? What's our proactive step? So I don't want to paint all sports institutions with a broad brush of, hey, they're all concerned with this, lining their own pockets, or they're not taking this seriously. It's like the anti-terrorism industry, there's lots of good people inside sports that are genuinely concerned about it.
Right.
However, having said that, I believe there's much more that they can be done. And the real rose that they refuse to grasp, the thorn that they refuse to accept, is that there's sports officials that are involved with fixing games with the fixers.
Right.
And again, our viewers are probably sitting there in front of their desks, in front of their computer, their mobile phones, whatever, going, in shock, saying, this can't be true. Who is this guy? So I urge anyone who's watching this, again, if there's any doubt, go check my story, front page of the New York Times, last June 1st, with Jure Longman, where we showed that there were officials in the South African Soccer Association that were aiding the fixers to fix games just before the start of the last 2010 World Cup.
Wow.
And those aren't our words. Those are the words of South African soccer officials and FIFA itself in a confidential FIFA investigation report that they hadn't made public until we did it. So inside the sports industry, people know there's a problem, but they haven't really grasped that thorn and said, how do we get rid of the corrupt officials so we can properly bring in good governance?
But you'd think that, the stakes for them, to their reputation, are so high that they'd want to deal with this in a very proactive and perhaps very punitive way. What's your sense for why there's so much reluctance?
The analogy that I use with my students when I'm lecturing on this or teaching on this is that they're like the owners of the meatpacking factory who've just released toxic meat to the market.
Right.
They kind of don't want, obviously, to kill people, but they also don't want to take the reputational hit of letting people know that they've produced toxic product. And that's really what I think is going on here. We've got a problem of toxic product. And again, I want to stress, this is a short interview, it's a brief interview, we can't get into my methodologies, we can't discuss this, but very briefly, everything that I'm saying in this interview, everything that I base my work on, my journal articles, my lectures, my books, is based either on court documents, direct interviews, or robust statistics and peer-reviewed research.
Right.
So, this is an acknowledged problem and that we've got to deal with it, and people really aren't dealing with it in a proper way.
Right. Now, in some respects, I mean, it's these international governing bodies that in a way set the tone for the behavior of the people involved with it. And FIFA is quite controversial.
That must be the understatement of the year.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, the way
Chiron underneath, understatement of the year. Yeah.
The way in which they go about awarding cities the games for the World Cup, whether it's South Africa or in Brazil or now Qatar coming up. I mean, there's a lot of controversy and criticism around the opaqueness of the whole process, the high costs, in some cases, people being displaced to build stadiums. Why shouldn't we expect players and officials to engage in this type of behavior when the governing bodies themselves are engaging in less than transparent practices?
Look, there's a whole bunch of issues that you mentioned. I think you're completely right to do them. But actually solving match fixing at high levels of international sport is extremely easy. As some of our viewers will know, I was the first person to talk about the presence of fixers at the big World Cup soccer tournaments, at these big things. That's now been acknowledged by FIFA as a genuine fact and as a genuine challenge to the thing. They're still, however, engaged and indulged in a very odd response. We can stop fixing at these big international soccer tournaments, and that's simply by paying the players properly for being at the tournament.
Right.
This is basic rational choice analysis. As academics, we know this.
Right.
You have players from many of the African countries, many of the former Soviet countries, who show up at these big international soccer tournaments and run onto the pitch. The stadium is full. The sponsors are all there. The game itself is being broadcast to billions of people around the world, in almost every country from North Korea to Bhutan to, Zambia to the United States. Yet they're not being paid.
Right.
So you think, why isn't it just really easy to get those payers paid directly? And what's happening is that FIFA is giving the money to their national soccer associations, and often that national soccer association is pocketing the cash and then giving the players a bunch of malarkey.
Right.
And you saw that last year in 2014 in the Brazil World Cup, where the Ghanaians went on strike in the middle of the tournament. They said, "We do not believe we're going to receive the money that's been promised us. We will not pay. We'll nationally embarrass the country of Ghana unless there's a plane chartered with our cash and it's delivered to us." And it wasn't about, by the way, it wasn't about the money. There's a great video of a chap that I've met and interviewed called Sully Montari, who was a star player for the Ghanaians, walking around a slum of Brazil, handing out cash to people, saying, "Hey, you clearly need some cash, here's some cash."
Right.
So this isn't for them about money, it's about the principle of the thing, about playing in a major international sporting tournament and not being paid properly.
Now, are the sponsors concerned about this?
Not as much as they should be.
Right.
And I think this is the key to change. I think that if 1% of the world sports fans wrote to Adidas and said the following: "We deeply respect your company. We deeply respect what you're doing. You produce a good product, you're a fantastic product, but Adidas sponsors FIFA."
Right.
And I think Adidas really needs to crack a whip and say, "Look, we don't want to put up with this anymore. We have to change this." And I think if sports fans said very respectfully to Adidas, "Look, we respect you, but we're going to buy Puma."
Right.
Unless you do this, unless you make changes.
Now,
There would be changes if 1% of soccer fans or 1% of sports fans did that. There would be change.
Wow. Now, one could say, it's sports gambling. People make a bit of money here, they lose a bit of money there. Really, it's not that significant. What are the social costs of match fixing? Are there larger repercussions beyond simply, some people, making a lot of money on a game and some people losing it?
When I was doing my doctoral research, I came across a cliche Soccer is a religion. It's a
Right.
new religion. And at first I was quite skeptical about that. I was quite cynical about them. Until I went to Kenya and I spoke with an academic, a fellow Oxford academic who was doing research in some of the slums of Nairobi. And I use that word slums because that's what the people there use to describe their conditions. And she said, look, if you look at what religion does, it provides a sense of community. It provides a sense of theater. It provides a sense of purpose greater than oneself. It provides a sense of a vehicle to transport our morals, our ideas, and our values. Soccer is the new religion. You see that. The final chapter of my first book is about young girls really coming up through soccer, being brought up through soccer. And I think this tide of sports corruption really puts all of that at risk. It puts all of those values, all of that sense of fair play, all of those sense of decency that we have at risk. And I think, not to be dramatic, but as you can tell from my research, I've risked my life to bring the world this story.
Right.
And I do it because sports has really given me some of the best moments of my life. It's given me some of my best friendships. It's given me some of the best senses of being with people in another way, in another way, beyond money, beyond this stuff. And I would really feel as if as if my generation has failed if we don't protect this sport, if we don't protect this, and if we allow world sport to become like Asian sport, which is really a graveyard of hopes, dreams, and visions.
Right. Now, I mean, at the beginning of the interview, some of the examples you cited were thousands of years old. I mean, is this really just human nature, and there will always be some level of fixing that, and the issue is really not whether it happens, but how much of it happens?
Yeah, look, as I said at the beginning of the interview, there's always been sports corruption.
Right.
There always has. But what I've been at pains to emphasize throughout the interview is that this is globalization meets sports corruption.
Right.
So in the same way globalization has transformed the travel industry, it's transformed the journalism, it's transformed any number of institutions and things, the same thing has happened to sports corruption.
Right.
So, and really it's had an exponential effect on sports corruption. It's really driven it. Because of the size of this gambling market, you now have leagues, for example, the Canadian Soccer League here in Canada. It's really a third-tier league.
Right.
Games are watched by a couple of hundred people. Some of those guys are walking their dogs and kind of watching the game. It's now worthwhile fixing those games on the Asian market.
Wow.
And 10 years ago it wasn't. But because of now the liquidity on this market, because it's now offering these games, much more sports, much more games, much more events are at risk. I may leave you with one final analysis. The sport of sumo wrestling, and there are people out there who will debate this. It has a tradition of competition going back either 900 years or 300 odd years, depending on which sources you believe. And I'll leave that to the historians to argue. But what is undeniable is that there has been a national championship held in Osaka, and that has only been suspended twice in their history. Once was in 1946. And I don't think I need to explain to any of our viewers why that was happening. Much of Japan had been leveled by a bombardment by the American Air Force. The country was in chaos. There was, real starvation. There was a risk of starvation. And the Japanese sumo wrestling at that time said, you know what, we're not going to have our national championship because it's not appropriate.
Right.
The only other time in hundreds of years of history of sumo wrestling where the national championship has been cancelled was in 2011, when my Japanese colleagues got hold of the text between the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, and key members of the sumo wrestling stables, either wrestlers or coaches. They're showing there was so much corruption, there was so much arrangements, so much gambling motivated fixing in sumo wrestling that there was no point in having a national championship anymore. Wow. So I'd ask our viewers to remember that metaphor of a leveled, destroyed, bombed out sporting world.
Right.
That is what Asian sport in many circumstances looks like now, and that is what international sport will look like unless we get a grips on this situation.
Right. So just to wrap up, are you hopeful that things can be turned around?
In tonight's lecture, I'll lay out a number of solutions. I believe that actually this particular battle, and I'm not suggesting in any way that we can always wipe out corruption or criminality. It's part of human nature. But I think we can take on globalized match fixing relatively easily. And that's because the chief architects, the chief fixers have either been arrested or been detained. What they haven't been is put on a public trial where they can talk about the network of corrupt sports officials around the world who help them. And if we can arrest those corrupt sports officials around the world, make public examples of them, say this is what happens to you if you fix games just before the South Africa World Cup, where you work with guys that are doing that, you're going to end up in jail, you're going to end up losing all your money, you're going to do this. We can put a significant chill in this globalized sports corruption. Unfortunately, those people have not been put on trial. Right. And until they do, I think the battle will go on.
Right. Declan, this was absolutely fascinating. Congratulations again on the book. Mm-hmm. It's been wonderful having you on the show. And
thank you so much for having me.
Best of luck with your book tour.
Cheers. Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in. You've been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Declan Hill on the topic of corruption in international sport. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation and an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. Every week on the program, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of international relations here to the studio at the Center.
Cordial Georgian gentleman who took us out for dinner afterwards at his Georgian restaurant. And we were a bit stuck for conversation. And so I said, I guess you like hockey, do you? And he said, yeah, I like hockey, it's okay, but I really love football. And he began to tell the story of how he was at the 1994 World Cup in Pasadena, in California, in the United States, when they're having their final. And he wasn't in the stadium, he was in the VVIP section, the very, very important people section, along with a whole bunch of dignitaries. And he wasn't just in that box, so that there's maybe 200-300 people. He was right in the front row, one or two along from the then president of FIFA. And I had two thoughts in my head at that moment. I thought, one, I really hope I get out of this restaurant alive. And two, if I do, what was this particular man doing at the very epicenter of the world's sport?
Right.
So I had the good fortune to get a scholarship to go to University of Oxford a few years later, study informal governance and corruption studies. And that was really the impetus, so we were able to take a look at informal governance and corruption inside sport.
Right. So just so our audience is clear, what do you mean by match fixing?
Well, match fixing is the great cancer that will destroy sport because it's transforming a game, a competition where people are supposedly running around as hard as they can, into theater, into a prearranged World Wrestling Federation kind of nonsense and things. And I don't use that word lightly. I remember interviewing a guy when I was doing my doctorate who was a Serie A player, or at least a former Serie A player, very good player. And he was quite open about fixing, and he said, I really hate fixing.
For International Governance Innovation. And today my guest is Declan Hill. He is an author, a journalist, and an academic, and he has just come out with a brand new book called An Insider's Guide to Match Fixing in Football. So welcome to the show.
Great, thank you for having me.
Well, first off, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
When did you first become interested in match fixing?
I was an investigative journalist for a Canadian documentary program, very much like 60 Minutes or Panorama in the US or UK. And we were looking at the links between key Russian mafia figures and National Hockey League players, hockey as in ice hockey,
Yep.
that is really the religion of Canada and a major sport in the United States. And we were over in Moscow interviewing the guy FBI and US Congress at that time had identified as, quote, the head of the Russian mafia. And he was I don't like it. You know why? Because I'm a football player. I'm not an actor.
Right.
And this is what match fixing will do. It will destroy competitive sport around the world.
So how is it done?
Well, look, fixing corruption in sport is not a new phenomenon. If you were to go to the site of the ancient Olympics in Olympia, in Greece now, you would see outside the stadium a row of ruined statues. And those statues were built with the money taken from coaches and athletes several, a couple of thousand years ago, who were caught fixing and cheating. And so their punishment was to pay money so that statues of the gods would be erected. So in my books, in my work, in my speeches, I'm not trying to say, oh, look, there's this brand new phenomenon, fixing. We've had it in baseball.